So you were born in Wivelsfield?
Yes, Weaselsfield.
Weaselsfield.
Right. Well, Wivelsfield is the name, but Weaselsfield is what it was translated from, if you like.
Right, okay. In Sussex?
Yes.
And your father was a dermatologist?
He was a dermatologist, yes.
But he also played the piano?
Yes, he was, I would say, an extremely accomplished piano player. Though, curiously, you know, he would have mastery over maybe 7 major pieces at any one time. Rather like his linguistic abilities. I mean, during his life, he probably learned and forgot about, 7 or 8 languages, because he couldn't take more than one on board at any time. When he retired, he went to live in Wales and was asked to join the Residents' Association, and then about 4 months later was asked to become president of the Residents' Association, and he went down there and delivered a half-hour acceptance speech in Welsh. That was the sort of man he was. He could hold on to things in extreme detail and wonderfully, but only until it was supplanted by something else.
Right.
He was enthusiastic about everything. He just couldn't take it all. Couldn't take it all on board.
As a piano player, was he interested in jazz?
No,
or?
jazz was anathema.
Right.
Indeed, actually horror to him. He didn't understand it. I mean, originally he was sort of like tied up, should we say, with the romantic composers.
Right.
Later on, he actually sort of ventured as far as Charles Ives and stuff like that, where he actually, I think, found the connection.
Into jazz?
Into jazz, yes.
But did he ever admit it to you?
Tacitly, yes, which is to say that we did not see eye to eye for the first 40 years of my life, but somehow at that point, I think he realized that there was another way of life.
Right.
And I grew much, much fonder of him.
Right, okay. Did he teach you to play the piano? Because
no.
You had sort of some inkling of piano when you were a child.
He attempted, when I was about 4, to have me taught to play the piano, and he would stand over me with a ruler, one wrong note, and down it came, whack. Then I succumbed to tuberculosis, and for 2 years I escaped his attentions, and music was out of the window as far as that was concerned, and I didn't actually return to music until, really, I was gone 20.
When did you first hear jazz then, and when did you become hooked on it? When did you discover it?
I suppose I discovered jazz as such. Well, the great moment in my life, I was about 7 years old. I had just 8 years old. Whatever, I can't remember. Somebody gave me an album, one of these things which contains a dozen records, which had 5 records in it. That much I remember, and I remember that there was Pryor's band playing The Whistler and His Dog, and there was also a bitten copy of Whiteman's Truly, and that, I think, was the turning point. I mean, all right, he was Henry Bussey, but he was doing his Keppard thing.
Yeah.
I think that was the sort of point at which I realized that all of this Bach, Beethoven, Brahms stuff, well, not for the birds, I still love the stuff, was not half as important. And as I grew to understand the conversational quality of jazz, the process of instantaneous and immediately alterable compositional qualities of it, I was hooked.
So did you then go and spend all your pocket money or whatever on
absolutely.
records?
Yes.
So where would you get these records from?
Well, I used to buy them in shops, having not discovered at that time that there was such a thing as a junk shop where one could buy things for threepence.
So these, first of all, initially you were buying new records?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
what sort of
a
things?
a new record, you see, would take a month's pocket money.
Yeah, sure. So what sort of things did you discover early on that you really liked?
Oh, I bought, because they were cheap, I bought the Fatswaller BDs, and I bought the Armstrong Deckers, and things like that. Because, I mean, these could be picked up at sort of a couple of bob a shot, if you were lucky. I think the official price was £0.50, but if you wanted, shall we say, the Benny Goodman Orchestra, it was going to be 3 bob, and anyhow, it didn't have quite the satisfaction anyway.
When you were at school, you played the drums.
Very briefly, I was co-opted as a drummer for our school dance band, which used to sort of play once in a while for school dances, probably about 3-4 times a term.
What sort of age would you be then?
12 maybe.
Right. Okay. Then moving on a bit, you did army service in Austria.
Service?
Well, you were in the army, shall we say?
The army, I think, having sort of asked me to offer my life for king and country, then wasted it horribly. I mean, it was sort of like 3 years of total waste, as far as I was concerned.
What were you actually doing, or meant to be doing, in Austria?
Well, when I was in Austria, I mean, I found myself doing various things. I mean, basically, I was, shall we say, a slightly upgraded clerk. I had qualifications, in fact, to become a staff sergeant. That's beside the point.
Was this just after the war had finished?
Yeah. I mean, I actually went in what was it, March 45.
Right. So just at the very end.
Yes,
of it.
at the end of the European War.
Yeah.
Didn't get to see any fighting.
Yeah. Did you see the effects of the war? And what was the country like?
Oh God, yes. I mean, hell, I lived in Sussex, and the Germans seemed to have this habit of carting a load of bombs to London, not quite reaching, coming back and dropping everything that they had left on us.
When you were in the army, you took up the guitar.
Yes, this was very late. I mean, this was sort of like in the last couple of months of my army service.
Okay.
Somebody actually gave me a guitar.
Right.
And I acquired another one shortly thereafter for 20 cigarettes, which I still have.
Were you playing other instruments at the time?
Oh, no.
Just guitar.
And I taught myself to play the guitar quite fortuitously. I developed a 5-string system. And on leaving the army, I became a 4-string banjo player. And after early days, doing a quartet thing down with Eel Pie
Island, yeah.
With Norman Day and
John
Postgate and George Melly.
Yeah.
Norman and I and George joined Mulligan en bloc.
I was going to ask you about the Eel Pie job. How did you get to play with?
I don't remember.
Was that your first semi-pro or pro?
Oh, absolutely,
job?
yes. Yeah. I don't remember. I suspect that somebody else had the idea, and I fell in with it quite happily.
Right.
I mean, at that time, I mean, my only instrument was the banjo or guitar.
Yeah.
Both of which were played tuned as a guitar.
So when you came out of the army, around London, did you sit in with bands at all, or
no?
Jam
Because
sessions?
in fact, at that time, I was actually I was still living in Sussex at that time, although I was sort of, as it were, stationed in Ealing because I had managed to get myself a temporary inn at Ealing Studios, thanks to John Greenwood.
And what were you doing there?
Sound.
Right.
But when it came to the crunch, I was told, yes, if I can get a union card, I can have a job, and if I had a job, I could be given a union card, and it was just a sort of circular nonsense.
Catch-22.
Catch-22, and so that actually never happened.
Right. So going back to Eel Pie Island, what was the actual venue? A club or a hotel? Or?
Oh, it was a sort of rambling hotel place in a state of extraordinary disrepair. I mean, it was virtually the only commercial building on the island. I mean, Eel Pie Island isn't very big.
No.
and you had the only way you could get to it was across this sort of footbridge.
So what sort of audiences would turn up? Small enthusiasts?
They were just small, I would say, pretty casual audiences. They certainly weren't enthusiasts. I mean, we weren't offering anything, shall we say, wildly exciting.
What was it? A sort of trad jazz, revivalist jazz?
No, I mean, we were only sort of a quartet, or at best, I think on occasion we actually were a quintet. And I think we played, memory says we played quite a lot of blues stuff,
right.
which
suited George.
Which suited George very well.
Yes. Do you remember George quite well, George Millie?
Yeah, though I haven't, I think, now seen him in, at least 20 years. The last time, in fact, I saw him was on, I think it was Paddington, no, King's Cross railway station. He was getting off a train and I was getting on one, and we sort of passed each other, as it were.
Right.
Said briefly hello, and that was it.
This sort of work on Eel Pie Island, what sort of money would you be getting for that?
I don't even remember that we got any. If we did, we were overpaid.
Was it every night that you were playing?
Oh no, once a week sort of stuff.
Oh right, okay. How did you and Norman and George come to join Mick Mulligan's band?
I don't know that either. I think Mick suddenly found himself without anybody,
right.
And we went and filled up a band with Crooksville, a band which already contained Pete Howell and Bob Dorbarn. And a drummer. The only thing I can remember about the drummer was that he had in fact been attacked by a shark at some point and still bore the scars.
Not while playing?
No, I think not.
Was the band well known then? Because it certainly became well known.
Mick's band, I suppose, had quite a number of gigs. Certainly I remember going out and playing with the band. We in fact recorded once at 9 Piccadilly Arcade, and
was that your first recording?
I suppose essentially yes, though even at that time I had already recorded myself.
Right.
And I suppose the earliest time that I ever played with a band in a recording studio was I don't remember exactly where it was, but it was in Bold Street, Liverpool, and I and a friend had gone along to witness this recording of the band, but the clarinet player and the cornet player failed to show, and my friend had a cornet thrust into his hands, and I had a clarinet thrust into my hands, neither of us having more than a passing acquaintanceship with these instruments, and in fact a record was made. I remember very little about this, though curiously Peter Tanner was here about a couple of years ago and said he'd been talking to somebody who remembered me at that session.
Oh wow.
Listening to the record. I do in fact have a copy.
Right.
All I can say is I'm amazed that I didn't completely screw the proceedings.
Well, that says something about your abilities. What was the actual recording of?
We did a thing called Bold Street Boogie, which was a feature for the guy who actually ran the band.
Mm.
And a version of Jackass Blues, which, I mean, it really quacks like a duck. It's pretty terrible. But on the other hand, you know, you could go back to that recording and say, hey,
Yeah.
something may come of this.
Yeah.
Because at that time, as I say, I mean, we only had really passing acquaintanceship with these instruments. I suppose I've since discovered that I was in fact a natural musician, which is to say, give me a musical instrument and I will get music out of it. I mean, give me a biscuit in an elastic band and I'll get music out of it.
Do you have perfect pitch?
No, thank you.
Were you also in visiting bands in London? I mean, there were a lot of bands around the time, George Webb and...
I went to see the George Webb Band, actually, when I was still in the army. This must have been about 1946. King or St. George's Hall, I think, was the venue. And I was on my way on leave from Catterick camp, going home, I think on a 4-day pass or something. And I stopped off in London to hear the George Webb Band. I mean, it was sort of one of these great experiences because one had never before actually seen 7 guys standing up there making music. Oh, it was pretty lumbering stuff, but on the other hand, it was real.
Yeah. As somebody that was already collecting the classic recordings, did you view the...
Well, by that time, of course, I'd heard the Oliver Creel Band and things like that.
So having heard these classic recordings and then seeing bands that were really, to all intents and purposes, copying this music...
copying, I think, was probably the important word at that time, because I think probably the idea of absorption hadn't really sort of entered the, call it the trad revival scene. I mean, all right, so the professional musicians who'd been around in the 20s and 30s knew about absorption. And I suppose initially, I must have had some sort of idea of copying. But this fairly quickly turns to absorption. This was very much a turnover point. I mean, if you take a guy with reasonable ears who's interested in jazz and play him a record from, shall we say, the 20s, he will be able to say, oh yes, that's black or that's white. By the time you get into, shall we say, 1950, the ability to separate them becomes quite difficult.
To distinguish.
By the time you're into the mid-60s, there's no way, simply because the cross-lamination and the absorption has taken over, and we have, in fact, a unified language.
Right. Some of the great, now revered classic recordings by Oliver, etc., in England before the war were thought of as an anathema in a way to what was respectable jazz, at least in the early 30s.
Early 30s, I think the people who had any interest in jazz had interest in the white fraternity, which is to say the Nichols, the ODJB, things like that.
I just wonder why then suddenly after the Second World War there was this complete reversal in that the Nichols camp was rejected in a way.
Yes, it certainly was. I think very much as a result of the ascendancy of Bunk Johnson and his cohorts and the presentation of what was in fact a very simplified, even primitive form of jazz music. Although one can see the connection between what was happening in the 40s and what was happening in the 20s. I mean, the manner in which a three-part front line standard from clarinet. And I better answer.
Okay, I mean, I suppose really the point I'm trying to make is I wonder why in the post-war Britain that there's all this austerity around, and why suddenly this music from the other side of the world almost at the time that was already in a way something that was old suddenly took off in such a big way and caught the public imagination as much as musicians' imagination.
I can't answer that one. I suppose one of the great things about jazz music is that you don't have to be very good in terms of being able to handle a musical instrument to play jazz, because if you can actually only play one note, but you know how to play it and where to play it and so forth, that is a start. And I mean, you go on from there until eventually you can create wonderful musical images, harmonies, and so forth, without thinking. The without thinking business, I suppose, you might say, could be illustrated by the fact that when I used to play with the Silori band, I used to read science fiction while I was playing.
So your conscious mind was on the science fiction, and this stream was sort of unconscious thoughts coming through the trombone.
Yes. I mean, they say that Julius Caesar could hold a conversation on one subject while writing on another subject and listening to a dissertation on the third.
It must have seemed a bit disconcerting, perhaps, to certain people in the audience to see somebody playing the trumpet. Perhaps they thought you were reading musical scores.
I really have no idea. But I was very much into science fiction at that time, and there seemed absolutely no reason why one should not do these two things at once. I mean, at that time, I used to do a lot of things simultaneously, simply because one could achieve a lot more if one's actual sort of manual requirements could be dovetailed together. These days, I find that it's hard enough to keep my attention on one simple train of thought.
You took up the trombone in about 1949.
Yes.
What made you decide to pick the trombone?
I didn't. I think it was Bill and Ken Collier who turned up on the doorstep when we were living at Longford and said, how would you like to help us form a band? And I said, fine, fine, fine. And my brother was there and he said, fine, fine, fine. And so, following day, couple of days, whatever days later, we simply stacked all the instruments that we had into the back of my Austin 7, and we trundled down to the Crane River. And at that point, it was decided that because we already had a banjo player in Ben Marshall, that I should take up something else. And I was, as it were, given the trombone chair, if you can call it that. So, I mean, I was not a trombone player, but I happened to have one.
So how quickly did you learn it to be able to play it on a bandstand with the band?
I think we made a recording 3 weeks later, which will attest to the fact that it was not a waste of time.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there are sort of things like the day that my brother left with me an alto saxophone, which I taught myself to play it and made a recording of it that day. And I called it all afternoon, simply because that's what it took me to do it. Bob Mickleborough came in here one day at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and he said, I think this might interest you. He handed me a sarrusophone, which I put into order, taught myself to play, and sketched an arrangement, and made a multiple recording, all in 2 hours.
The sousaphone is a double reed.
It's a double reed conical bore instrument.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Very nice, and I wish to hell I could get hold of one.
Was it? It wasn't a bass one. Because that's what Bechet plays, of course, on the.
Well, I don't
on
know
the
whether it
transfer.
is a bass one that he plays, because this was the same pitch.
Mm.
And I think it was actually sort of like a tenor or possibly a
Oh,
baritone.
baritone.
Certainly, I can imagine a much larger instrument.
Mm.
But you know, some instruments appear to speak at pitches unrelated to them. I mean, for instance, a baritone sax can often sound lower than a bass sax because of its peculiar timbre.
Mm. Coming back to the Crane River jazz band, that became quite popular quite quickly as well, didn't it?
Astonishingly popular. I mean, we had this little venue down at Cranford at the White Hart. It was a sort of a shed out at the back, quite a large shed. I mean, it was about 3 times the size of this room, constructed of timber and corrugated iron, painted green. And that place used to be absolutely packed. In fact, I remember occasions when there were people actually sitting on the cross members of the roof in rows. I mean, I reckon it might have been quite dangerous, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, getting that much weight up there. But yes, that place was absolutely packed.
How many times a week would you be playing there?
There again, I don't remember. I think we probably played once a week or something.
Right, right. And the band was also recording, of course.
Yes, the band recorded. We also played other dates, sort of Nottingham, Sheffield, and places like that. I would say we were in pretty fair demand. Mind you, at that time, the number of bands around, I think, was not that great.
Right.
And although I would say that perhaps we were not very good at it, the competition was not that great either, and we were actually, by default, regarded as one of the better bands around.
Right. Did you broadcast at all?
I remember that we did in fact do a broadcast from, what's that great big palace place?
Oh, Alexander Palace.
Alexander Palace, yes, we did a broadcast from there, and I remember it because the guy who was actually emceeing the broadcast was Leslie Mitchell of,
yes.
Was it British Movie Tone News fame?
Yeah, the voiceover man.
I don't remember exactly how it went, but there was some plot where what was rehearsed didn't actually happen, and I have to say that Leslie Mitchell managed to recover from this debacle quite extremely well. The opening shot was in fact of my feet. This much I remember, but I remember very little else about it. But that was our first television thing. That was television, and it must have been either the end of '49 or the beginning of 1950.
Yes, right, right. What did you think of Ken Collier as a player?
Ken was an astonishing man because he appeared, as it were, from nowhere as a fully formed musician. Now, I've never encountered any parallel. I mean, where had he played before? Nobody seems to know if he had played before. But the wonderful thing was that the guy sort of, he was born to it.
Some people are, I think, aren't they? They just automatically pick up an instrument and it's an extension of themselves.
Well, yes. But in Ken's case, he had an enormous grasp of not just the essentials, but the minutiae of playing jazz music. And oddly, I would say that his approach was rather better developed than, shall we say, that of Kid Thomas and Bunk Johnson and others, who he at that time regarded as the masters.
Yes, he was quite a purist in his outlook on jazz music, wasn't he? In that New Orleans was the epitome of.
Yes, and I think he understood the enormous value of the revival, which was an ostensibly extremely simple form of the music. I mean, I think he realized also that the ensemble was the important aspect. I mean, if you go back to the Oliver Band, the great thing about the Oliver Band was the ensembles. The fact that the Oliver Band didn't get louder to make a climax. They became more intense. Ken understood this. And although I think he very often led us beyond, shall we say, the crucial moments in final ensembles,
But in order to have that polyphonic sound, you've got to have a great deal of empathy between players. So was that the case in the band?
I think there was a growing empathy. I mean, one understood that if you've got the players on a football field, you have people who have certain functions. You have a guy who is going to be the centre forward, a guy who's going to be the left half, and another guy who's going to be the right wing, and again a guy who's going to be the left back, and a goalie. So understanding that there were areas in which one worked, one came to anticipate the intentions of the others, and as time went on, one realized that one could alter what others would do, even with a single note. And I think we actually worked together extremely well. Our greatest asset probably was the power of the band. I mean, it's not just that it was loud, which it certainly was. I mean, I remember one occasion we were playing at Earl's Court, one of these jazz jamborees, and the PA went down. And so they set us up as the only thing which would be actually heard throughout the entire building.
You didn't need a PA.
We didn't need a PA, no. I mean, you see, we had in fact done a lot of playing in the open air.
Yeah, right.
And when you do that, I mean, certainly you develop a sort of level beyond what you would usually say in a small dance hall.
Yes.
But also, I mean, there was the enormous power of the band. I mean, it really moved like a steam locomotive.
Right. Had an energy.
It had an enormous energy, much of which I would attribute to my brother.
Julian.
I mean, he was perhaps not the greatest bass player since sliced cheese, but as a propulsion unit, boy, wonderful.
Around this time, you formed your own record company called Ristic.
Well, in fact, well, manifestly, yes, around this time. In fact, it was sort of late 1949 when I produced my first reissue, but in fact I had the means to record, and indeed I recorded the Cranes in their earliest days.
When did you first become interested in sound engineering?
I should think about the age of 6.
Right.
Unlike most people these days who seem not to discover what they were intended for until they're gone 30, I had a damn good idea what I was interested in very early in life. In fact, it was in 1941 that I actually made my first disc recording, entirely on equipment that I had put together myself, and using as a blank recording disc, I had floated some candle wax across the back of a single-sided shellac disc, and I had cut a recording into that using the basic equipment of an earpiece of a telephone, which actually gave me a Hill and Dale cutter.
Yeah.
And while I can say that the recording was recognizable for what it was supposed to be, it wasn't really very good.
You're sort of being an Edison again then.
Yes, I mean I was experimenting as early as that.
Yeah.
With the recording of sound. So I mean you could say that I've been in this business for 60 years.
Wow. Yes. Yes. So when you formed your record label officially, as it were, it was called Ristic.
Yes.
Why did you call it Ristic?
This was merely a name which I had been given when a kid at school.
Right. And what was the reason behind forming a record label anyway? I mean, why not just be a sound engineer for another company?
Well, I wanted to do things which at that time were, shall we say, not ordinary.
In what? For example?
Well, I had no desire to become, shall we say, a countrywide or even international record company or anything like that.
No.
I only had an interest in disseminating music which I thought was worth disseminating.
Right.
I mean, my earliest recording equipments were largely sort of self-built or acquired for pennies, which were all that I had. I mean, in those days, to buy a piece of equipment, either you were dead lucky and got something which once belonged to the post office and had been thrown out onto a dump, or you had to have money.
Right.
The first Crane River recordings were made with microphones out of telephones, carbon granule jobs.
Right. So the early recordings that you were doing were both reissues and recording bands?
Yeah.
So what other bands did you record apart from the Crane River? I mean, in the early days?
Oh, not very many. I mean, I recorded basically bands that I happened to be in.
Yeah.
I mean, sort of come 1952, I made a couple of sessions of the Steve Lane Band.
Yeah.
And I made recordings of the Cy Laurie Band when I was in it, and indeed some in which I was not in it. Sandy Brown always promised me that he would actually organize for me to make a recording session of the Brown Band, but in fact it never happened. The Temperance Seven I recorded. I also recorded later on quite a lot of bands, mainly at the behest of Doug Dobell.
And how would these records be marketed?
Well, I mean, Dobell's records on the 77 label, I mean, they were marketed from Dobell's shop.
Right.
They didn't appear anywhere else. And indeed, we were faced with a big problem by the purchase tax system, which said that you could produce 100 copies and not pay any tax. But if you produced 101, then you'd have to pay tax on the lot. So many of those records actually only ran to 100 copies.
Right.
So, but this was enough really to satisfy the immediate demand.
And did you actually ever make any money out of it? Or?
Oh, good God, no. At least I don't remember making any money out of it. Any more than I really remember making money out of music until the Temperance Seven. Not that we made an awful lot out of that.
Let's say there was a demand for a particular recording and you only pressed 100. Would you press more to satisfy a demand in those days? Even if you had to pay purchase tax?
Well, actually, one could get around that by making a separate issue. And in fact, in the 60s, what I did was I would perhaps issue something on Ristic, and finding that 100 copies was just not enough, I would completely remaster the thing, cut a new master and go through all the processing and everything, and produce another, which would be a new cut on my other label, which was Bateau Chinois. by double translation into junk. um, yes, I could get over, should we say, an additional 100 by doing that,
Right.
and still remain, as it were, within the law.
Going back to the Crane River Jazz Band, you left it in 1951. Why did you leave?
Well, now that's a very interesting thing because only a matter of about 3-4 years ago, the guys were here and we were sort of doing an alleged rehearsal for something coming up in the future, I think it was Pat who said, "Why did you leave us in 1951?" And there was a sort of, I think, following chorus of 2 other guys saying, "Yeah, tell us, why did you leave in 1951?" And I said, "Well, I was fired." Fired, they said, by whom? I said, "Well, Bill came to me one day after one of the Cranford sessions and said, sorry, John, the guys have decided that they no longer require your services." Well, who am I to argue? I mean, I just went away assuming that everybody had decided that they could do better with Ray Orpwood, which the idea was quite reasonable. So, in fact, I didn't understand. I never discovered until sort of more than 40 years later that, according to the rest of the guys, it was Bill who had taken this upon himself.
And claimed that he was representing everyone else.
We'll never know, I suppose, the exact truth of the thing. But that at least is how I now see it.
Right.
I mean, nothing rankles or anything.
No. In 1954, you joined Cy Laurie on trombone.
Well, yes, I sort of said, well, come. So at that time, I was working for British European Airways, and they were paying me £7.11 for 6 months a week.
To do what?
And said, I was sort of somehow associated with the organisation of manufacture of spare parts for aircraft.
Right.
It was almost a non-job. But when Cy said, "Well, come and play a couple of nights a week for 15 quid, double the wages," and suddenly I had time to develop the recording activities.
Right. How long did you stay with Cy?
Oh, well, combination of events. Because Sandy Brown came down from Edinburgh and said to Al Fairweather, who was at that time playing with Cy, "Right, I'm now down in London, we're going to form a new band." I mean, Al had been with Sandy up in Edinburgh before. And so Al went and we got Alan Elston instead. And then, a couple of weeks or so later, Al and Sandy came to Alan Thomas and myself and said, "How about leaving Cy and coming with us?" And knowing something of Sandy and Al, and seeing perhaps that we might learn a bit more, we went. We left Cy slightly, but not really seriously, in the lurch. And went with Sandy. I mean, wages with Cy were 15 quid a week, and with Sandy it was 4. On the other hand, I learned more about jazz in 20 months with Sandy than I'd learned with Cy.
Why was that?
Sandy understood things about jazz which I hadn't even dreamed about. And I mean, all I had to do really was listen.
Can you elaborate on that at all?
Well, simple example. Sandy had identified the fact that the notation, the actual scales used in jazz were slightly strange when sort of allied to normal European music, in as much as the important notes in the key of B flat actually occur in the key of A flat. And if you look at Stanley's playing, you will find very often that he's actually playing an oriented A flat in a B flat situation. Little things like big things like this. I mean, they were sort of ear openers. And the possibilities of the music began to expand.
So was this at the stage where you were being more interested in arranging then?
I was never really interested in arranging, although, of course, later on, Phil Harrison and Alan Cooper came to me and said, would I arrange for the Temperance Seven? I've never understood why they wanted me to come and arrange for the Temperance Seven, but I went up to the Royal College and heard the band, and it was a very interesting sound indeed, a little bit, a shade Ricky Tick maybe, but the interesting thing about it was that all the guys at least doubled on instruments, and I thought, wow, the scope is wonderful.
Yeah.
The fact that most of them couldn't read anyhow was no deterrent, and I evolved a system of sort of writing arrangements in which nobody had more than about 8 bars of stuff that they actually had to put together with some other 8 bars.
But that sort of adds to the sound of it, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was simply using their talents, because having discovered what each of them would do in a given situation, I mean, this is very normal arranging methods. I
Dipping out the best in a band.
I cribbed stuff mercilessly from the California Ramblers and the Fletch Henderson Orchestra.
I'm going to come on to that.
And ran up, shall we say, a repertoire sufficient at least to allow us to play a good evening's program without repetition.
Did you teach yourself to read music as well then?
Yes.
But in most of the bands in the 50s, these revivalist bands, they were not sight readers, is that true? Or?
Oh, I would say very small proportion of readers, and certainly not sight readers.
So why would you then therefore be interested in reading music?
It was not a matter of reading music, it was a question of if you want to actually put, should we say, 3 instruments together to produce a particular sound. I mean, be it only 4 bars of 3 saxes or a couple of bars of trumpet and trombone, if you can actually write it down, it's there, and all you've got to do is play it.
Yeah.
And as soon as the 2 bars or whatever is over,
then you can.
They then go their separate ways.
Yeah.
But if you keep on bringing a band together and allowing it to diverge, bringing it together and diverge, you get this excellent scene of never a dull moment.
Yes, yes.
So minimal arrangement will in fact give you the opportunity of varying sound and
the dynamics.
Yes. I mean, there's very little limit to what you can do just by chucking in odd 4 bars of arrangement here, there, or wherever.
Just before we come on to I want to talk about Temperance Seven, but before that, you played with Acker Bilk for a couple of months. Did you not?
Yes, indeed.
And how did that come about?
I don't know how it came about, but Acker said, come on and let's do these things. I mean, I think he had he rather liked the idea of the filling out of an ensemble with the sax.
Right.
But in fact, I remember there was a night at Eel Pie Island where the promoter came up to Acker in the interval and said, if you turn up here with a saxophone and a guitar again, that's it.
That's rather getting away from the revivalist, at least the purist revivalist lineup, isn't it?
When you consider that all the people out there had heard George Lewis as a clarinet player, and it had not occurred to them that actually throughout the 1930s the guy had in fact played saxophone.
Yeah, and how some of the famous, famous to those that know about them, bands in the 20s in New Orleans often had a sax in the lineup. So,
Oh, absolutely.
so there was nothing.
There was actually nothing new about using a saxophone player, a player in a jazz band.
I think perhaps that's the sort of romantic notions that come about when you get this revivalist movement.
Well, yes, I mean, what we heard, of course, was Bunk Johnson, Jim Robinson, and George Lewis.
Yeah.
We heard sort of like Kid Thomas with Albert Burbank. This was sort of what jazz sounded like. It was a trumpet, clarinet, trombone thing.
Yeah.
And if you strayed out of this, the people said, "Yeah, you can't do that."
Yeah.
On the other hand, I mean, I saw the sax as an extremely vocal instrument, and actually, let's face it, it's probably the easiest of all the instruments to play. Mind you, I mean, there are an awful lot of people who can get around the saxophone with incredible technique, but have no idea about how to actually make a note of value.
Yes. How to communicate with the audience. Yeah. I mean, it seems to me. I mean, the saxophone has a beautiful, or can have a beautiful tone, a very vocal tone. I mean, I think there's not much closer to the human voice than a tenor sax when it's played.
Oh, indeed.
Properly.
Yes.
And yet that.
Well, what is properly? I mean,
when it's played,
nobody these days playing jazz music on a saxophone plays the thing anything like Adolf Sax intended.
Yes.
You know, I mean, the last people who followed the ideas of Adolf Sax were probably Paul Bees, people like that in the early 20s.
Yeah.
After that, people realized that it wasn't merely you stuck a reed on a mouthpiece and blew it. You could actually control the reed with your lips and,
like a vocal
and
chord
tongue,
almost.
and you could make the thing sing or talk.
Yeah.
It became an extremely versatile instrument, and the fact that every single member of the saxophone family has a very distinctive tonal quality, which separates it from all the others. My hat off to Adolf. You know? It's quite astonishing how different they are. I mean, the tenor saxophone is not just merely a smaller bass saxophone. It has an entirely different character within the instrument, not just the way the people use it.
Would you say that of all the instruments that you played, or that you play, that the sax is your favourite?
No, I don't have a favourite.
You don't have a favourite?
I don't have a favourite. I mean, I play the sax because I think I find it more useful. But I also like occasionally to play a bit of trombone, and I also play, not very well, a little cornopian. There are, in fact, fleeting recorded examples of me on so many instruments. I suppose I've done an awful lot of experimenting.
Your sax playing, to me, sounds it's got something of a sort of a bit of a trombone-ish feel about it.
Well, maybe. It is, I think, probably based in the sort of early trombone period, stylistically, but if you really looked at my saxophone playing, you'd probably find that I owe a hell of a lot to Toby Hardwick, and I owe a similar amount to Cliff Edwards.
Oh, right.
I mean, Cliff Edwards, I think, is probably responsible for much of my style of timing.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
I mean, he was a wonderful musician who happened to be a singer rather than a musician. But when you listen to him back in the 20s, I mean, he was doing things which were a distinct parallel to what Armstrong did with the Henderson Band in 1924. He changed the vocabulary.
That's interesting. I hadn't considered that at all.
I mean, I can sort of like pull a couple of records and demonstrate this quite easily.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, when you think that in early days, of course, studios had their own staff vocalists, and we
Yeah.
had the extremely competent guys like
Kaufman.
Irving Kaufman, Chip Bullock, Arthur Hall. Absolutely, totally competent. They could take on anything and deliver it very reasonably with a measure of interpretation, which was really what a vocalist was about.
Yeah.
And then you get a guy like Edwards who comes in and completely reshuffles the thing. You know, I rather feel that without Cliff Edwards, Red Mackenzie would never have existed.
I want to just move on to the Temperance Seven now. How did you come to join this band? Was it already well known?
Well, locally, I mean, it was the sort of Royal College of Arts shindig band.
Right.
I never really understood why Phil Harrison and Alan Cooper came to me and said, would I arrange the Temperance Seven? I was not known as an arranger. I think I was only known as an enthusiast of that period of music.
Perhaps that's why as well, then. Perhaps that's why as well.
Well, maybe.
What was their repertoire before you joined? Well, because I know you were responsible for introducing certain numbers that became very well known.
Yes, but I mean, they already played Pasadena. They already played You're Driving Me Crazy, but they didn't sound the way they sounded by the time we recorded them. I mean, basically, all I did was sort of, you might say, update them by 3 or 4 years to actually pull them into a wider audience. And I think, incidentally, make things easier for everybody to actually capture a public.
And it was an unusual band as far as I can see, because it wasn't the ordinary revivalist Dixieland type band. It was stretching beyond that and using what was to some of the revivalists things which were anathema, recordings by Whiteman and things like this. So it must have not engendered itself to some of the revivalists.
No, it wouldn't, and its sort of rhythmic formats at the time when I first encountered the band was, to say the least, somewhat archaic. The interesting thing about the band was that somehow they had understood and captured an element of the spirit of the 1920s music.
Were there any other bands doing that?
No.
So they were totally unique?
Absolutely. There was nothing even remotely like it. I mean, shall we say, give it another few months, and we had the Bonzo Dog, Doodah Band, and one or two others. I mean, later on, the Pasadena Roof Orchestra.
That's the obvious one that you can make a connection. But they were the first.
The Temps were the first.
Yeah. I get the impression that the band, when you listen to the recordings, it's a sort of strange mixture of tongue-in-cheek and yet paying reverence to the original recordings.
Actually, not very much tongue-in-cheek.
They had a humour about it.
There was a humour, but...
You've got all these names for each other, and how did all that come about?
I don't know. I think it already existed before I got there.
But you became the Sheikh.
Sheikh Haroon Wadi Jr. Yes, you know, John Geeves Watson. Actually, Geeves arrived about the same time as I did, I think. But I suppose already there was Alan Swainson Cooper, cyclist extraordinary. Yes, I think that most of that was sort of fabricated by Brown and Acker.
Right. Yes.
I mean, we really the thing which killed the band in its original concept was the fact that people were looking for the funny hats rather than the music.
Right.
We were interested in the music rather than the funny hats. On the other hand, the funny hats had actually helped to bring us into the entertainment business as such.
I mean, once you're in the entertainment business, as you put it, you have to compromise to a certain extent if you're going to a very wide public, do you not?
Yes. you have to compromise. You know, it's like if you write a novel, you have to have, shall we say, a chapter which contains a lot of action, and one which contains your sex scene, another one which contains perfidy, and you know, the elements must all be arranged and brought together. Otherwise, the thing will just die on the bookshelf. And so there's an element of something for everybody.
Yeah. And also, when you become, you know, as the band did, become very, very famous, it also, I suppose, becomes something that you have to devote your time to.
Well, in the case of the Temperance Seven, yes, it did in fact become nearly a 24-hour day job. We had a chap who was organizing our gigs. I can't now remember the name of the guy, but someone will. And very much conscious of things called exclusion clauses, which meant that if you were playing in one place one night, you couldn't play within a certain mileage of that place the next night, otherwise it would screw the promoter. And for a period, I think, about 8-9 months, we found ourselves in the situation of being booked into Inverness one night, Truro the next, Maidstone the next, Holyhead the next. And in order to get from one gig to the next, you had to sort of come out of the gig, get in your car, and drive through the night. And if there was any time left, then you grabbed yourself some kip and a meal and appeared on the next one. I mean, we did quite a bit of this by coach, but a lot of the time we were actually sort of doing
your own driving.
Yeah, doing our own driving. I mean, for 2 years, I actually clocked up well in excess of 70,000 miles a year.
What sort of audiences was the band attracting?
I would say a very, very strangely mixed audience, because sometimes we would find ourselves playing to a younger generation, and other times playing to people of previous generation.
Right.
I mean, I remember playing at the Hammersmith Palais on one occasion and suddenly being aware that dancing had ceased, and there was this phalanx around the bandstand. And curiously, I would say at least 50% of that phalanx were musicians. Not just our sort of, shall we say, current generation of trad musicians, but older guys.
Right.
And they were sort of standing around literally with their mouths open, jaws hanging somewhere near the floor. Mind you, I think that some of the people merely came to discover whether in fact we played in the flesh what we had on the records. Because if you look at some of the records, some very strange things happen. And they're not fabricated, they actually happen that way in the flesh. I mean, instrument changes in sort of like a beat and a half.
Yeah.
And, you know, the putting down of instruments and picking up of instruments, and all part of the visuals.
Yeah, sure.
But also part of the arrangements.
You played trombone mainly in the band. Was that your first instrument?
No, I was playing trombone and sax, trombone and alto sax mainly.
Right.
But on the other hand, I suppose at one period I was going on stand with 7 instruments.
Right, right. And most of the I mean, all of the bands from Frontline were soloists. But were there any musicians that stood out in your mind as particularly good musicians within the band?
In their ways, they all stood out in my mind.
Right.
I mean, there was not one of them who did not have unique attributes. I mean, you could not find a greater sousaphone player than Martin Fry. I mean, he had a tone as big as a house. The fabulous things about people like Colin Bowles. We could go on a riverboat shuffle where the piano was a semitone flat, and he would play in all those incredible keys, and like half a tone down from everybody else. Colin could play in any key, and it didn't matter to him because I don't think keys meant anything to him. Cooper, who was an extraordinary clarinet player
Yes, he
who
was,
produced wonderful singing melodies.
You're talking about your arranging. I noticed on certain numbers, like that certain party, that's taken directly from the Goofus Five.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, because it sounds as if you've directly taken.
Oh yes, I suppose I probably had no great talent as an arranger, but on the other hand, if you've got no talent as an arranger, lift something from somebody who has.
And Chili Bon Bon was from the Savoy.
No. Now that one, I don't think I actually used any model
Right.
on Chili Bon Bon. In fact, I think at the time I didn't even own a recording of the number. But certainly, you know, things like words, for instance, was partly based in the Henderson recording.
Within a couple of years after joining the Temperance Seven, it achieved national fame of the highest order because it had these parade hits.
Oh yes,
with
yes.
You're Driving Me Crazy and Pasadena and Heart Hearted Hannah. Did the fame take the band by surprise at all? Was it? I mean, it was quite rapid, wasn't it?
It was indeed quite rapid. I don't think it actually surprised. I don't think we really realized what had happened. You know, I mean, in a period of probably only hardly weeks, we found ourselves catapulted from relative obscurity to near national fame.
Yeah.
I mean, very quickly, I suppose. I joined the band late in '59, and sort of by about March of '60, we were making records which sold 1 million copies.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you became so famous that you took part in the Royal Variety performance, which must have been a memorable occasion.
I don't know about memorable occasion. I don't remember very much about it. In fact, my memory is obviously at fault because I was sure we had played 2 numbers.
Right.
But in fact, I've got a very, very ropey video of what we did, and we did in fact only play Pasadena.
You also took part in a film, It's Trad Dad.
Well, we appeared in It's Trad Dad, yes. Quite an extraordinary film in the manner of its presentation. We also appeared in The Wrong Box.
Oh, did you? The Hancock, Hancock's in it.
Well, everybody's
in it, yes.
Everybody
yes,
was in it, and curiously, that thing has not hit the television in the last 20 years.
No, it's still available. You can get it on videos.
Can you?
Yeah.
I must get myself a copy. I mean, I'm actually sort of, I think, only visible on the screen for about a second and a half.
Aren't the band pallbearers or something?
Well, no, we were actually a brass band on a stand.
Right.
And as the various vehicles went by bearing coffins and so forth, we had a number which switched between, shall we say, funereal to bright and jolly.
Right.
When I remember that I was actually more or less behind a pillar of the bandstand for most of that. We also made a film called Take Me Over, which virtually disappeared without trace.
Right.
The National Film Library has in fact vouchsafed they've got a copy, and they are going to make me a copy.
Excellent.
In which we played 2 full numbers and some other fragments, which I only remember as 6M6, whatever that meant. It was something put together, I think, either by Bob Mickleborough or... no, it couldn't have been Bob Mickle because he hadn't come in yet. It must have been Cliff Bevan who did that. I have faint memory that there was another film that we were involved in which didn't appear. But there was also the Italian film, a thing called Toto di Notte or something, for which we made 3 tracks, and they actually used only 1. in which we appeared in sort of monk's habits and played Running Wild, and the only time I've ever seen it, it was on a video, and they'd actually sort of taken it down from letterbox down to normal size, and in fact you hear but do not see. Cephas Howard's on the one end and Ray Whittam on the other. You hear them, but you don't
they're cut out.
They're cut off at the end. Whether in fact there is any version of that which has the entire band in shot, I don't know.
The band's recordings themselves they're beautifully recorded. It has a lovely quality about it. The band. Were you partly responsible for the recordings?
Let's put it this way: I did in fact stick my oar in early days, but I don't think it made a great deal of difference because I remember George Martin saying to me, "Well, remember this, we are not recording the Temperance Seven, we are making a gramophone record." To which he added the rider, I'm sure it must have been a bit tongue-in-cheek, "Oh no, we never go out to a live performance of anything, lest it should destroy our ears for making gramophone records." But certainly I had something of a row with George Martin in the early days, because the first sounds that they produced were not what we had in mind. Some of the recordings are in fact very good, others were not. I mean, for instance, if you hear the EMI version of Words, we actually recorded it, I think, on 3 separate occasions, and they never managed to balance the thing correctly, and yet we did the same thing for the BBC on one of the early days of jazz programs, and they got it right like that.
So did you have an input in terms of positioning of microphones or anything?
Well, I think we were in a transitional stage in the recording industry at that time, in as much as the stereo crossed pair was sort of like a fairly new idea. So also was proximal recording, that is to say, you have 8 musicians, and so you have 10 microphones and you balance the thing afterwards, which is always a mistake because the perspective goes out of the window.
Yes, right.
I think we were sort of robbed in the perspective department. That, I think, is only my opinion. I mean, it may have been that we would never have sold any records if we'd done them the way I would have liked to have done them.
Well, the band had a sort of self-imposed semi-pro status, did it not?
I don't think any of us wanted to be full-time professionals, no.
Right. So were the band all doing other things at the same time?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I mean, Cephas, for instance, was doing set designing for BBC.
Yeah.
Brian went into the publishing business. Eves had his graphic arts business.
And you were doing recording?
Yes.
Yeah.
We all had other things to do.
Right, right. And you left the band, although you never, I mean, you were still playing with them, but you left the band sort of officially in 1968.
Well, the band more or less broke up in 1968.
Right.
And when Brian had already left and had been replaced by Dave Mills, who tried to take it over organizationally, and in fact eventually succeeded and put the band through the Concorde flight recording fiasco. But by that time, largely with other people. I mean, there was, I think, still a nucleus of original members on the trip that took them to Hong Kong and brought them back overland or on tramp steamers, simply because nobody had told them they were not getting a two-way ticket, and they'd spent the wages while in Hong Kong.
But at that stage of your career, you were already well known as a sound engineer, particularly in the art of remastering 78s.
Well, I suppose so. I really don't know. I never really paid much attention to what I might have been famous for. I just sort of done my thing, and yes, I know that the press of the last few years has been extremely kind to me.
What drives your obvious enthusiasm for remastering 78?
Oh, always has been an earlier almost obsession with hearing sounds better, and indeed disseminating the music that I love.
There's a danger with remastering, isn't there, in that...
Oh, lots of them.
Can you talk about some of the dangers of remastering?
Well, difficult without perhaps being guilty of not understanding other people's motives for doing it the way they do it. All I can do is expound my own feelings, which is get everything and do nothing to it if you can.
Right. So what you mean is...
add nothing, take nothing away.
You want to retain as much as possible of the original recording?
Yes, even if it is even if it happens to be in a rather low proportion.
Yeah.
But merely to make sure that it's there because somebody may want it later.
So remastering must be therefore the art of compromise.
There is a measure of compromise, though I feel that in my case the compromise is that the performance is the important thing, and I will not clean it up at the expense of the performance.
Right.
I mean, there are compromises. I mean, when you consider that when you're cutting an analog disc, for instance, there is only a certain amount of time, level, character that you can put in, and you may have to juggle in order to do it. This is, I think, legitimate compromise, but when you are actually remastering a nugget, as it were, of sound, that nugget of sound is the important thing, and it should be as little disturbed as possible.
When a company approaches you to do a remastering job, what's your attitude towards them if they say, look, we're going to mass market and we don't want any surface noise whatsoever?
Frankly, I tell them to go somewhere else.
Right.
I suppose probably everybody has his price. I mean, my price, I think, is too high for anybody to pay on that score. On the other hand, you see, if you look at it this way, somebody brings a record for repair. I do, in fact, repair gramophone records. I won't say that I'm brilliant at it, but I don't think there's sort of like anybody else sufficiently patient to even look at the problem. If somebody brings me, however, should we say, a scarce Paramount recording, of which there are maybe 3 or 4 copies, then I will maybe spend 2-3 days repairing that record, and it will cost them nothing. On the other hand, if somebody wants me to repair a broken copy of Bing Crosby singing Home on the Range on Rex, I want 50 quid before I'll even look at it. If saving is important, then it doesn't cost. If its saving is unimportant, then it costs the earth. Really, I'm not in any of this to make money, merely to further my own ends of making some attempts to enable a future generation, and indeed present generation, to enjoy what I have enjoyed and get as much out of it as I have got out of it. I believe that if you palm off on the public a sort of dumbed down version, beautifully clean but lackluster performance, you're not doing jazz or the people any favours at all, and you will in fact drive people away from that sort of entertainment.
As we move, you're talking about dissemination, as we move further away from the, chronologically from the original recordings, there's a couple of potential problems I can see in that, for one thing, somebody with a young person with a young person's ears may have a problem listening to recordings pre-stereo, pre-LP.
Oh yes, and indeed there are answers to this. I mean, obviously, to read some great work in its original language. You'll get more out of it provided you can actually speak the language. However, Robert Parker spent a lot of time, thought, and care putting together stereophonic representations of early recordings. And in fact, I think did us all a favor. I mean, I don't like it simply on the basis that so you can't change the venue after the event. But he did make available some classic pieces in a form where people who had never experienced a 78 or even monaural recording could actually, to a point, enjoy masterpieces of a bygone age. And I think you know, he should be handed the golden platter for this.
Right. Do you think that listening to these recordings, therefore, for younger people, needs education? They need educating to be able to appreciate the recordings?
I don't know about need education. I think education is something which happens at the moment you get interest. I mean, you can't just teach someone to listen to acoustic records or something like that. But on the other hand, if you play them a sound from an acoustic record sufficiently well represented that it will actually fall upon their ears well, and they like what they hear, then they will go out and they will pursue similar examples of what went before. Object achieved. But if you let it be known by, shall we say, rather under bushel type recordings that you can't really expect very much from an acoustic recording, they will simply say, well, it's hardly worth digging because I'm unlikely to find anything. If, on the other hand, you can throw something at them, shall we say, from 1920, which, although acoustic, may be well enough reproduced, well enough recorded in the first place, that there might even be some doubt as to whether it's acoustic. It might just be an electrical or something. At least delivered across a decent spectrum, so the ears can extract what they need. Then you're doing the people a favor, because they are then listening to the performance and not to sort of through a glass darkly, as it were.
The other, I suppose, potential problem, the further away we move from them, again, chronologically, the less and less they are played anyway, so that there are some younger people now who just never heard of, who haven't heard any of the classic names, and therefore can't appreciate music because they simply don't even know it exists.
Well, yes, I mean, we do have a segment of the public out there who think that jazz started with John Coltrane.
Yeah. And might even think that he's getting old-fashioned now.
That may indeed be the case. Nothing seriously wrong in this, because, I mean, if you are, shall we say, not avidly interested, if you are merely looking at enjoyment of this music as something which is only a small part of your life, does it actually matter whether you know who Joe Oliver was?
Yes.
I would like to think it does, but I can quite see that it is not important. What irks me, I think, are those who write, often seemingly eruditely, about the subject of jazz music, without actually having heard anything from the first 30 years.
But if jazz is a form of music that is, by nature, I suppose, transient in that it's always moving, why is it important to listen to recordings from 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago?
It becomes important, I think, because whatever your interest, call it homework if you like, to know where each development came from. I mean, whether you are simply reading a book and you suddenly wonder, oh yes, well look, I'm reading this book and it's basically made up of these 26 characters. How did they appear and how would they have looked 100 years ago? And what is the relationship? I mean, we look at this currently commonly used computer-generated sans serif typeface in which the sequence RN looks like an M, simply because something small fault in the design. I mean, it's probably only a hair's breadth or whatever, but at least you can understand going back. I mean, when you're sort of looking at the old faces, Garamond, Times, Benoni, these were elegant faces, but all right, they were not appropriate to all reading content. There are some things which actually need to be laid down in other type to get the atmosphere. And if you are constantly fed with this bloody sans serif computer derived face, you never actually get the joys of having a typeface appropriate to the subject, to the message that is being delivered.
So that's the same with music then?
It's the same with music. If you don't understand why, where, who, when, at least trace it back, should we say, a generation or two before the area of your particular interest, you're going to lose out on your enjoyment of what you're listening to.
What you're listening to, right, okay. Now, you've got a very impressive collection of jazz recordings on 78. Now,
it may look impressive.
It looks impressive to me, yeah.
But I'd love a time machine to go back and buy it all brand new from the shop.
Yeah. As a collector to another, I'm interested to know what, apart from their rarity, the values of these recordings are to you, apart from their musical content, as inanimate objects, do they have any intrinsic value apart from the music on them?
Not really. I mean, I know that there are collectors who buy records and they put them carefully on the shelf in numerical order and say, I've got those.
Yes.
No, each of these little round black things is in fact, in my view, only the key to a time machine, which is to say you take one of them from the shelf, you put it on the turntable, and you are treated to a 3-minute segment of time which happened 70, 80 or whatever years ago. Oh yes, it's very nice to have the original artifact, but you will find that I don't have all my General Mortons on Victors and Jeanettes. You will not find my King Olivers on Jeanettes.
So if you had say a Jelly Roll Morton on Victor that was a sort of a V plus, and then you had a Bluebird of a master pressing that was N minus.
I'd take the Bluebird.
You would take the Bluebird.
Absolutely.
So you're not a stamp collector.
I'm not a stamp. Well, I am a stamp collector, but I actually collect those little horrid pieces of coloured paper as well.
I mean, in terms of records, you're not a stamp collector.
In terms of records, I am not a stamp collector.
No.
I am only looking for the most complete version of a recording, which is to say, if it happens to be an Australian HMV as opposed to an English HMV or an American Victor, I'll take the Australian simply because by and large it's likely to have more accessible information.
Right.
No, my only interest in original labels and things like that, yes, they're pretty to look at and so forth, but they're only there because they happen to have the best reproduction I can find.
So what do you think about other collectors that do collect for that reason?
Well, they have another reason for collecting. I mean, whatever you collect, stamps. I mean, some people merely like to think of their stamp collection in a bank vault as being a hedge against inflation or something stupid like that. The reasons for collecting are many. My reason for collecting this stuff is to have the music and to be able to pass it on.
Yeah. So if I was to play a sort of Faustian role and offer you the chance to go back in time and hear King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band live for a week, but in exchange you have to give me all your King Oliver recordings in order to do that. Would you do it?
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Right, okay.
No doubt about that. I mean, you know, there are in fact a couple of very, very nice copies of Jeanette's. There's one Paramount, there's an OK down on the shelf. There are a row of Brunswicks, Vocalians and things like that. I would happily give them all for one night in a decently seated at the Dreamland, you know, or whatever.
Right, okay.
Yes.
Right, right.
I don't think that, I think the memory of such a real experience would quite obliterate any feeling of loss of the records, but I would probably, having given away the records, then at least rest happy in the knowledge that I've got them on CD as well, created by myself from those very copies. So you know, well, what's the problem?
Is there any record company from the, particularly from the 20s, that you admire their standard of recording quality and consistency?
Yes and no. Some of them were very good. Some of them, from time to time, may be called boo-boos. I mean, I love recordings by the early OK Company.
The acoustic recording?
Acoustic and their primitive electric, some of them. Some of the true tone OKs. The style of recording appeals to me.
For what reason?
Very hard to say the particular reason. It is a style of delivery which simply falls well upon my ears. There's a sort of warmth and clarity that can be gained from these records. I like the mid to late 20s Victor records because they are very human in the way they're recorded. All right, so you can fault them on technical grounds, but on the other hand, you can look at the later Western Electric Columbias, which are difficult to fault on technical grounds, but which do not have that human aspect.
So, for instance, the way that the Victors capture Bix's bell-like tone and the Columbias don't, is that the sort of thing?
Yes. There's a lot to be said. That's quite a good example. I mean, when you look at the Count Basie band recording for Decca in the late 30s, when they move over to Columbia, or OK as the case may be, you've got an entirely different kettle of fish. The Deccas are actually so much better than the later ones, although technically the later ones are probably better than the Deccas.
It's just what they capture.
It's what they capture and how they capture it, how they present it, all of these things. I mean, there are recordings which are sort of totally magical when you look at some of the, should we say, 1925 recordings from the old Sunset Hollywood Company, and you observe how beautifully even, warm, and actually clean is the recording. And then, of course, come about June 1926, and all hell breaks loose when they try to go electric, and the result is totally obnoxious. Some of the early electric recordings were notably worse than their acoustical predecessors. Some classic recordings suffer abominably from recording which one can only describe as a travesty. I mean, when you think of the Erskine Tate sides with Louis Armstrong, I mean, they're harsh, badly confused, and you actually have to listen using effort to actually gather the merits from the performance.
So this is an occasion where technology isn't advancing the
well, you know, so often, I mean, look at your compact cassette thing here, launched in the 60s. The format and the small machines were very nice, but the quality was by and large very difficult to achieve simply because of the pre-emphasis necessary to overcome the small area of tape and the abysmally slow speed. This, of course, becomes improved later on with better quality tapes and so forth. The thing was launched before it was ready. This is true of much of the electrical recording. I mean, when you look at Orlando Marsh putting his electrical recordings up virtually for grabs by about 1925. In fact, he'd been recording electrically before that. But those 1925 recordings are absolutely horrific in their distortions. Whereas there were, at the same time, shall we say, those lovely Fletcher Henderson things on the brown wax vocalions, which have a beautiful, even clarity. Look at some of the Jeanette recordings, notably of bands like the Les Black Aces, which, if you've got a really nice copy, deliver with enormous clarity and range. Yes, I mean there are recordings that I love, but for the recording itself. But there are so many different reasons and so many different things that they satisfy. I mean, it all comes back to the business of using the appropriate typeface for the subject matter involved.
Yes, it's a good analogy. Would you ever consider retiring?
Oh, yes. Yes, I wouldn't mind retiring, but on the other hand, I still feel needed. But there is very good evidence now that I think I have served my purpose, because there are now enough guys who've understood their mission in life that if I croak tomorrow it wouldn't really matter. And I mean, there are guys now out there who actually do it better than I do.
There are still guys out there who cock it up as well.
Oh God, yes. And I mean, there have always been guys who cocked it up.
I mean, the other thing I think is that as the technology of remastering, particularly with availability of cheaper software, a lot of people are potentially going to be remastering.
Well, yes, and the great thing about this is that given the opportunity, they may come up with a new way of looking at it that may pay immense dividends. I'm only sorry that those guys who have bought their computer and have bought a couple of programs of remastering software, as it were, probably will never concern themselves with the manner in which the recordings were originally made, how they were processed, how they were pressed, all of which is essential information merely to get from the disc to the needle. So, you know, this is where homework pays off. If they are actually interested in doing the job properly, they will in fact go back in time and see what the guys did in early days. Knowing how a thing is constructed will allow you to take it apart and rebuild it. If you have no idea how it was constructed in the first place, you are already on the short straw.
So you have to understand the technology of the recording and
some of it
records.
At least.
I mean, the basic understanding.
You know, I mean, how many people out there who are remastering may, in fact, be totally unaware of some of the quirks of recording, like normal Hill-and-Dale recordings by Pathé as opposed to those by Edison, completely different system. Or even the Emerson people who produced a series of recordings which are actually modulated at 45 degrees or thereabouts, rather than vertically or horizontally. Or how about cylinders? How about constant linear speed recordings? There is so much out there, and each time you add a new fragment of knowledge, it affects the whole concept. It's quite difficult to actually present someone who's just gone out and bought himself a computer and a couple of programs software, the whole saga of how it all came about, since Edison and Berliner, within a mere 3 weeks of each other, managed to produce two systems of recording and playback. We had recording much earlier than we had playback. I mean, you can find sound recordings from the 1820s, but they had no way of playing them back.